Good evening and welcome to this Indie Scot News Midweek Special. I'm the host, I'm Eva Comrie, the Equalities convener of the ALBA Party, and tonight's episode is entitled Unjust Scotland, Our National Health Crisis. Now, our current health crisis are obviously drugs and addiction generally, so I'm pleased to say that we're joined tonight by James Doherty, who is a recovery activist, and by Anne-Marie Ward, Chief Executive Officer of Favour UK. She advocates for people who are recovering from and suffering from addictions.
And thanks for inviting me onto your programme. It's a privilege to be able to talk about a subject that's really close to my heart. So I'm in long-term recovery for addiction, and I was a wee boy who cycled into addiction pretty early, and part of my campaigning in Scotland has been about trying to raise the awareness about why the pathways to recover from addiction are actually really poor. There's pockets of really good work, and I know that if you get the right support in the right environment, you can actually overcome addiction and be returned to who you're supposed to be in the first place. But a big part of my work, Eva, was raising awareness on the stuff that I believe underpins addiction. So when our drug death crisis spiked to the worst in Europe, and probably the worst per head of population in the world, it was basically a clear indicator that we are also one of the most traumatised countries in the world. And you only really need to look at the Adverse Childhood Experience study to find the evidence and the research behind that. And for me, there is an over-reliance on the medical model, and you'll not prescribe your way out of drug death crisis. Absolutely no chance, because the nature of addiction is, as Vincent Felitti puts it well, who was the originator of the Adverse Childhood Experience study, he said that addiction is you can't get enough of something that almost works. So that applies to medications as well. And I'm not against medication. If medication's used in the proper context that it's meant to be used in regards to widening people's pathway to the psychosocial support needed to overcome addiction. But one of my biggest frustrations is that myself personally, I needed to be took out of my community because of how gravely ill I was. So Scotland's now recognising addiction as an illness, but very few people can actually describe to you what the illness is. So when everybody's in agreement saying, "Oh, this is an illness," and you say, "What's the symptoms of the illness and what's its various manifestations and what's the best treatment for that?" Very few can enter into that discussion with you, and that's probably one of the biggest reasons why the system fails, because it's trying to apply solutions to a problem that doesn't fully understand. And that's why I believe we've got the highest rate of drug deaths in Europe. And Anne-Marie will probably be able to speak about the infrastructure as well and some of the systemic forces that are driving this, and also what exactly needs to change, because she's an expert in that arena. But fundamentally, I believe if the broader policy approach doesn't focus on the prevention of problems in the first place, i.e. adverse childhood experiences, there's no many activists apart from myself and Anne-Marie and a few others who are talking about the early rearing environment and what people need to fulfil healthy development. And that's one of my biggest frustrations, because we're really good at tertiary and secondary prevention, but when it comes to primary prevention and creating the conditions for a healthy, happy childhood, then if we don't get that right, then there'll be more people seeking relief in substances, because addiction is an outcome of trauma. So I'll leave it there and then I'll let Anne-Marie come in.
Thanks very much, James. That was very moving. Anne-Marie, as James said, over to yourself now, please.
Thank you very much for inviting me tonight. And just picking up on what James spoke about with regards to the infrastructure in Scotland. I was very, very unfortunate yesterday to look at my Facebook memories from 10 years ago. And if you don't mind, I'll just read out a comment that I made. It's quite a lengthy comment, but I posted it on Twitter. And it says this, basically. Over the last 15 years, so this is from 10 years ago, remember, there's been considerable attention given to creating and recreating administrative structures through which to tackle Scotland's drug and alcohol problems. We have seen the institution of drug action teams, alcohol and drug action teams, the Scottish Executives, Drugs Forum, the Scottish Advisory Committee on Drugs Misuse, the Scottish Ministerial Advisory Committee on Alcohol Problems, SMACAP, and the Effective Interventions Unit. Most recently, we've seen the emergence of alcohol and drug partnerships, the National Drugs Evidence Group. This is about 14 health boards, 42 community health partnerships, 8 community justice authorities, most lacking in coterminosity and creating a fog of complexity. The critique here that I'm offering is that these complex bureaucracies have often lacked authority and absolutely accountability, and have been not only cumbersome, but have been completely slow to respond. Even with the best intentions of all the political parties, they have up until now provided or not been able to provide the impact required. To date, drug policy in Scotland has swayed between a focus on health and a focus on criminal justice concerns. There is a need to accept that alcohol and drug problems are fundamentally social problems. This means moving beyond medicalised or criminal justice approaches to creating a new holistic response that addresses a much wider agenda. This has to focus on purpose and meaning, child and family welfare, employability, family support, and community will. Now, that was written 10 years ago, guys, and this is why I'm a big advocate of people in recovery leading this field, because at the moment we're led by a range of experts who James described there, who don't know what this illness contains, they don't know how it manifests, and they certainly know nothing, and I mean literally nothing, about the solution to how to recover from it. So,
thank you, Anne-Marie. Your sound was a little bit distorted there, so is it all right with yourself if we finish with you there and we go on to hear from Neil Hanvey, please?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Thanks very much, Eva, and it's great to be part of such an important discussion. I'm going to try and be constructive, but probably a little bit radical in my comments. So my experience with addiction goes back to when I first started working in the NHS. I originally trained as a mental health nurse back in the 80s, and we dealt with in acute psychiatry. We dealt with people with various different substance misuse, so alcohol and drugs, and it was all really quite basic. I have to say, it was treating the symptoms and minimising withdrawal, and then putting people back out into the community with very little support, with very little therapy, meaningful therapy, whilst they were an inpatient. But I've been aware of the impact of drugs through contacts that I've had socially, and through experiences that I've had personally where substance misuse has been a problem, and I've seen people's lives completely fall apart as a result. I've also been part of the recovery when people have managed to pull themselves out of that situation. But the lack of support and much of the collateral damage, if you like, that goes along with substance misuse is not really being addressed in a way that's particularly helpful. It's all happening in a context where the Misuse of Drugs Act is still in statute. It criminalises people who have a significant health issue and doesn't really facilitate any meaningful change. And whilst I really value all of the work that various organisations across Scotland beyond do to support those who are recovering. The reality is that the fundamental cause of this is social policy. And just like poverty, just like low wages, it is not an accident. This is a completely predictable consequence of poor social policy, of the removal of employment from large parts of our community, the lack of hope, and the fundamental impact of all of the trauma that goes along with disenfranchised communities and deprivation. So the solution is not necessarily straightforward, but it's, for me, one of the key guiding ambitions that we need to do, and that is to challenge the social policy, not just of Westminster. I think we need to build a vision for a different type of social policy as we move towards independence. And there's lots of really good examples. There's Portuguese example of how they have transformed their approach from a criminal justice and punitive approach to one of public health and decriminalisation. I think we need to accept the fact that that is not going to be a solution overnight, because just because you decriminalise drugs and you remove that element of the ongoing trauma, so people who have got a serious health problem then find that they've got a criminal conviction that acts as a barrier as they go into recovery to the choices and chances that they have. So it's not a straightforward process of just decriminalise, everything will be fine. There needs to be serious investment in assisting those who have experienced substance dependency over a number of years, giving them the proper support that they need to deal with their health condition. But that will, if we don't tackle social injustice and we don't tackle poverty, wages, and lack of opportunity, then we will only allow the cycle to repeat itself. And we have to tackle that fundamental problem, because if people get the message from government that they don't matter, their community doesn't matter, then it's very difficult to lift their gaze and give them hope for some other type of future. And it's totally predictable. And along with that, we have a culture that celebrates and rewards greed. People who are wealthy, obscenely wealthy, are celebrated, venerated almost. And there's something fundamentally wrong and broken about a society that values the holding on to such enormous wealth that could never be spent, and a lack of philanthropic endeavour. I mean, there's token gestures here and there, but there's a fundamental issue that has to be addressed right at the heart of this, and that's social justice. That's the only way we're going to fix it. So I think that there's three broad things that we need to do. We need to change the context in which substance misuse happens, and that's decriminalisation. We need to give sufficient resources to help people who are currently suffering those health challenges, to lift them through their recovery. But we absolutely have to change society's view of social policy and stop celebrating greed and have a much more equitable society. All of the badges that go along with addiction are no accident either. They are used to dehumanize people who are suffering great injustice and been through trauma, and we need to look at all of the available resources to challenge that pernicious discourse. And I'll finish at that.
Thanks very much, Neil. I think that what you've made plain, as did the others before you, that poverty's got an awful lot to answer for here. And I don't want to reduce our discussion to statistics, but there's a few that are hugely important, I think, and I don't think anybody here will disagree. It seems that you are 15 times more likely to die a drug-related death if you live in the most deprived than you are in the least deprived parts of the country. The figure in relation to alcohol-related deaths is somewhere between 5 and 6 times. So I think it's pretty clear that poverty has much to do with the grave nature of the statistics that we see there. In terms, though, of where we go from here, I'd be really interested to hear from Anne-Marie and from James about what should be being done now. Who should governments or medics be listening to in the context of how do we solve this problem or begin to tackle the problem more realistically and more radically than we have so far? So, Anne-Marie, would you like to come in there, please?
Great. Yeah, so I'd just like to pick up on what Neil was saying about Portugal. You know, we've got pundits all over the world claiming massive success for Portugal, and we've got a £1 billion industry actually that is funding advocates of decriminalisation and legalisation. Many organisations are literally £1 billion of funding are going into making that a populist argument, and that's maybe one of the reasons why we've seen, if I'm being generous, the SNP focusing on the Misuse of Drugs Act. But let me just make this absolutely clear. The data in Portugal points to 4 things that they did that, by the way, it did not change the amount of deaths that happened, and that's what we're talking about tonight. What it changed was the HIV rates dropped drastically, and also the prison people being jailed for drug use dropped drastically. I can give you the statistics. I can put that in an email afterwards. But they did 4 things, right? The 4 things they did was they focused on prevention in schools, and they massively, and I mean massively, invested in their treatment industry. And the 3 focuses that they made in treatment, now wait to hear this, it was abstinence, social integration, and rehabilitation. That is exactly what we need to do in Scotland. And who did they put in charge of that? They put people in recovery in charge of it. So they had, the 3 focuses were abstinence, social integration, and rehabilitation. Currently in the UK, we spend over £600 million a year in our treatment system. The majority of that, by far, goes on substitute medication. I'm not advocating that we stop doing that or that we take that money away from that. But what I am advocating for is we have to massively invest and double that investment. After all, we have took at least half the investment out since 2010 and drug problems and alcohol problems. And when I say drugs, actually, I include alcohol because alcohol is a drug.
As a drug.
So we need to actually double the investment and put people who know how to recover from this illness. And one of the major things we have to do in Scotland is to get it out of the dead hand of the NHS. The NHS only treats the bio element of this illness. This illness has 3 elements. It's bio, it's psycho, and it's social. And the NHS only ever treats the bio. That's the medical. In the third sector can, if it's trained well, and if it has a workforce like in England that's made up of almost 50% of people in recovery, that's what we need to do. If we had that in Scotland, I would say currently our workforce represents at best 2% of people in recovery. The majority are social workers, nurses, all very good, compassionate, compelling, dedicated people, but they do not know how to. They can meet us down the hole, but they do not know how to help us get out of that hole.
On that point, Anne-Marie, do you feel that there ought to be a greater acknowledgement by, say, government, civil servants, medical practitioners of the lived and living experience of people? Is that part of the problem?
It's a major part of the problem. We currently in Scotland have 3 policy act or Quango organisations: Scottish Drugs Forum, Scottish Recovery Consortium and Scottish Families. Now, these are all paid for by Scottish Government. And what happens, they put forward a small pool of lived experience, and it's a bit like, to use a metaphor, it's like you're going into a garden and a wee patch of the garden is really, really sick and no plants can grow there. Whereas in Scotland, we have a very wide and varied, strong, healthy recovery community, which is in the rest of the garden that they don't tap into. So, you know, unfortunately, we get a very steered and framed discussion around lived experience because of that, because it's coming through government-sponsored organisations. And unfortunately, what people don't realise is that because the government pays those organisations and the cherry-picked people on those, whatever they are, collaboratives or focus groups, Gwangos, yeah, you know, they don't realise that the conversation's framed from the very beginning. They don't realise that there's an outcome already been, you know, the outcome's already been decided, and it looks as if they're consulting. And just in the last 3 months, I've had invitations to take part in 14 consultations across Scotland in a variety of addiction and mental health, and I'm absolutely, you know, just flabbergasted at the amount of consultation that's going on and how little of it is actually, you know, genuine or framed. But it ticks a box and it says that we've spoke to lived experience, and I think there's a terrible tragedy in that, because there's a lack of. I understand where they're coming from, and they're frightened of risk. They're frightened of outcomes. They're frightened of it going wrong. But if they keep going back to that same patch of the garden that's really, really sick, they're going to get the same dead flowers that they've always got.
No, thank you, Anne-Marie. I think Alan Petrie has got a question for you. Alan.
Yeah, it's just what you were saying. A couple of things about the consultation, especially. It sounds like the government have a major problem with any kind of consultation, because they consult you to tell you what they're actually going to do, rather than you tell them what you actually need. And that seems to be a massive problem with the SNP for a long time. The other thing is what you were saying about the people who work with addiction. There seems to be this myth that it's best for academia to be in there, when it's actually better with people who have lived experience. They're experts through experience. And I agree with you totally. We need more of that.
I think it's a well-worn trap to go down that Misuse of Drugs Act. Just be careful with that, Neil, because what they're heading towards there, and it's very obvious to me by the people that they've employed. I've been in this industry a long time, that is the route the current Scottish administration are going down. And there's no real evidence base for that. If you look beyond the Facebook memes and look at the actual data, it's not decriminalisation that's saving lives, it's good treatment.
Mm-hmm. I'd like to say something there about good treatment, actually, Anne-Marie. I've slightly had this conversation already on an earlier occasion with James, because I had some knowledge quite a long time ago now of the Castlecraig Clinic and the model of rehabilitation that they have there. And I know from research that was done recently, particularly by Leanne, who's here, that it's still very difficult to get into places like Castlecraig as an NHS patient. And again, there's a poverty divide there. It's easier, obviously, much easier to access a rehab place if you've got the funding in your own back pocket to pay for it. So I know that your pin tweet is true.
Can I just read you an email from a public health colleague in England today? It's just one line. He says to me, "How crazy that the Dutch government is sending clients to private rehab in Scotland that the Scottish people can't go to." That, my friend, is that must be absolutely devastating for you. And that's from a very senior public health colleague in England. We've got 100 people currently in Castlecraig, one of the best rehabs in the world. James will tell you more about Castlecraig, and it's full of Dutch people.
Would you like to come in now, James, in relation to that and related matters, please? Don't feel that you're restricted to talking about...
No, not at all. I've been in this arena a wee while, and you listen to mood music and people talk about looking at the international evidence when lived experience in this country. There is thousands of people in Scotland who have solved the drug problem. They know exactly what it takes to overcome addiction. They know exactly what it takes to prevent it as well. And they're the people who are the most silenced in the sector. And they are the people who get employed in the bottom rung of the sector, and they don't get to lead it for the top, middle, bottom. They don't get to influence it in any real meaningful way. And what happens when you're paid basically by a service, and everybody in their granny knows this, it's very hard to critique the ground you stand on if your level of numeration's tied up in the role. So you kind of compromise your integrity. So people like Anne-Marie and myself, it really takes a lot of courage to actually stand on the ground that you're being paid on and say, this isn't actually working. We shouldn't really need to rely on international evidence. Internationally, they should be looking at Scotland and saying they've got the best treatment model in the world. They should be learning from us, but they just don't let the people who live the experience lead it. I went to Castlecraig 17 years ago after, now I was in care when I was a wee boy. I was in the children's care system. I was in the secure children's system. I was in the young offenders system. And I ended up in the adult prison system. And at 27 years of age, I went to a doctor in Glasgow and says to them, I need to go to rehab. Can you help me? I don't want to go on any medications. I don't want substitute medications. I don't want any. I'll take my chances with the painkillers I'm using until I can get into somewhere. And they said, okay. And they started a process, and I was in Castlecraig 2 weeks later. And in Castlecraig, I was diagnosed with complex post-traumatic stress, and I got the therapy that treats that. And they helped me address the childhood trauma that I'd been containing that I never knew anything about. Now, the justice system wasted millions on me. Nobody in the justice system at any point stopped me on that journey and said, do you think you're suffering for the illness of addiction, me man? Do you? And basically laid out what the actual illness was and gave me a full knowledge of my condition. So like any illness, if you went to a doctor, you would get a full knowledge of your condition. I got that in Castlecraig and it blew my mind. I'm like, why am I only hearing about this at 27 years of age? And why am I only finding out that I've got childhood trauma when I've been all the way through all these systems? And it was people with lived experience. These were highly trained professionals, therapists. Even the doctor was in recovery. Now I tried to tell the doctor that he had no idea what it was like to be me. And he laughed and said, I actually do. And I said, well, why would you know what it's like to be me? Because that's the theme song of The Addict. You don't know what it's like to be me. If you could have put anything on my headstone, it would say, I'm different. You don't know what it's like to be me. And this doctor says to me, actually, I do. I'm in recovery for addiction, James. And this is the process you're in. And he told me what would be happening with me over the next few days during detox. And it blew my mind. I didn't think that middle-class doctors, I thought addiction was only something that happened in the poor areas. And here I was in Castlecraig, sitting in group therapy with politicians. There was an anaesthetist in the group session, a politician, a guy for the SAS, an American soldier, and just people from all different walks of life. And I started to realise that I was no longer alone with this. But more importantly, they had a methodology and a proven process that enabled me to be returned to who I was meant to be in the first place. And that's why I do this work today, because I left that treatment centre and went into prevention work and started volunteering with the Violence Reduction Unit because I wanted wider Scottish society to understand the trauma that young people have got, that gang violence, that violence was an outcome of trauma. It wasn't an outcome of bad choices. That addiction was an outcome of trauma. It wasn't an outcome of bad choices. That by the time people were entrenched in that type of behaviour, then they need intervention and they need us to provide a proper diagnosis so that they can make better choices in their life. And what's happened is, if I had to go to the system today with suffering the way I was back then I would really, really struggle to get into. I wouldn't get to Castlecraig for a start, so I wouldn't be afforded the therapy that I got, because there's no many treatment centres in Scotland doing the therapy that Castle Craig do. And what they did as well is, Eva, they opened up the wider aspect of the psychosocial support that I needed. And when I came back to the community, I had an aftercare plan, and they provided aftercare, and they supported me through that process. And in that whole process, I've got 3 children now who's never seen me in prison. They've never seen me under the influence. They've never seen me being violent or any other behaviours associated with addiction or the lifestyle that I came from, which is the total polar opposite of my own childhood, because my childhood was fraught with visiting prisons, growing up with alcoholism, domestic violence, alcoholism, just chaos. And that shaped my neural development and left me in a perpetual state of discomfort. And that's what's misunderstood, is that trauma drives addiction. Adverse childhood experiences is the biggest predeterminating factor for why people end up with addictions. And people don't want to mention the word ACEs because they think it's about blame. Whereas I'm a long time in recovery. I'm not blaming anybody for my addiction. I had to take, regardless of whose fault it was or what happened, it created so much discomfort in me, James, that he sought relief in substances. Regardless, it's pointless blaming anybody, because adverse childhood experiences they don't happen in a vacuum. It's intergenerational. And that's why we need to stop blaming, shaming and disgracing anybody, and look at what's going on and look at the system and say, this system's lagging some skills. And the people who have got the skills that you need are the people that Anne-Marie's been describing. It's people with lived experience and long-term recovery. Let them shape the system. And then we don't need to look at international evidence. They can look at us and say, let's copy what the Scots are doing. Because we're not that big a country, we could do this. And we don't need to kick it into the long grass and rely on decrim. That's the long grass. There's stuff we can do today that will help reduce the drug deaths.
James, that was very emotional. I think probably everybody in the room felt the same way. And I would like to say to you on a personal basis that wee James has become a giant of a man. And I think everybody here,
good for you, mate.
Everybody in our party, we'd like to hear from you and Anne-Marie, so that we can help you two to do what you are doing to change Scotland for the better, radically and immediately. So I would like you both to take away from here an offer from us. We would like you to help us to write our policy. And we want it to be radical, direct, immediate, and we don't want any more talking shops. We are here to listen, and we need to take very much into account your views and the views of people with similar experiences to yourself. So I know that was...
Can I just add, one of the guys that works for us is a chap called Dougie McMillan. He works for Favour UK and he's a member of your party. And he would absolutely love to, and I'm sure James and I could certainly help on the sidelines there. Dougie's been a veteran of the addiction field for the last 30 years. And yeah, we can certainly contribute to any policy going forward. I was just going to reiterate what James was saying about, childhood trauma and the importance of that. And, there's also a myth that people in recovery, that we're blaming or that we're claiming powerlessness over our addiction. And very clearly I come from a similar background to James, where there was, sexual abuse, violence, all throughout my childhood. I was just lived in a perpetual state of fear, still do some days. But what I was told very, very clearly and very, very quickly in my early recovery was, what are you going to do about that? Are you going to be a victim? Are you going to take responsibility? You've got an opportunity here to build a life where, being a survivor rather than being a victim. And we've got loads of tools. This was other people in recovery who said this to me. We've got loads of tools that can help you. Do you want them? So I just wanted to reiterate that, the childhood trauma is massive. It's one of the pieces of research that was done in Scotland around 2012 was around injecting drug users, and it was actually Scottish Drugs Forum that did it, one of the government quangos, and they proved that 72% of injecting drug users had experienced 5 or more ACEs on the ACE score list. So, nothing's been done about that, since 2012. That hasn't somehow permeated into our thinking yet. So, yeah, we'd be very grateful to, help raise your power and help raise our voices.
Thank you. We have a few more questions. Can I come to you first, Leanne, please?
Yeah, it's what James and Anne-Marie was just talking about there, and adverse childhood effects and events. Would you agree that poverty was also a traumatic event for a kid growing up and all it brings? I grew up in a council estate. I've got friends, I've got family, they've got addictions, and I've never seen any of them come out the other side either, by the way. I don't think it was ever available to them. They've not had the help there. And do you see things getting worse with the rise in the fuel costs, the rise in energy costs? Going to plunge more families into poverty, and with that, I think that brings chaotic lifestyles, stressful lifestyles, family breakdowns. I think things are going to get worse, and with the lack of funding and the lack of the proper funding where it's meant to go to help people, I can't see things getting better unless there's a massive injection of money and funds and going to the right places. Eva mentioned Castlecraig there. I was Googling up some of the residential rehab, and it all seemed to be private. I don't see anything. A lot of them reiterated that it was quite essential to get them in quickly when they decide to abstain from drugs or alcohol, and it's quite important to get them in quickly. But I don't see that happening if you don't have the money to be doing it. If you've not got any money, I don't think it's available. So can you see it getting worse? And do you think poverty in itself is a traumatic event for growing up in?
Well, I'll answer that. So the adverse childhood experience studies only get 10 traumatic events that can happen. So every one of them, it's own it, are detrimental to the parent-child relationship. So there's nothing really to debate about them. People want to debate the ACEs study all the time. The only limitations with the ACEs study is it doesn't take into account poverty, it doesn't take into account things like getting bullied at school, it doesn't take into account things like being a refugee. So they're all adverse childhood experiences. So your ACEs IQ needs to be broader than the 10 that's on that list. And everybody knows that poverty exudes massive stress on a family system. And the more stress that you've got in a family system, the more it affects your ability to emotionally regulate. And if you're dysregulated, it can show up in your behaviour. And that's what derails healthy development in young people, because the human brain, as the neuroscience shows, develops in response to the environment. And that's why the areas of high deprivation have got the highest rate of drug deaths, because they're the areas where the most stress is. So the fact of the matter is, it all comes down to the areas where there's most stress. So we need to look at lifting our culture out of stress, because we're one of the most stressed cultures on the planet. So it's basically about looking at strategies and policies that does down stress in the culture, and a big part of that is addressing poverty as well. But it's also recognising that blaming poverty can kick it into the long grass as well. So that's another frustration of mine, because if you've noticed that when some of the recovery activists started to hold the flame under Scottish Government's feet and the drug deaths were going up and up, this magic pot of money appeared. Did you notice that? So there's money there. Let's not kid ourselves that there isn't an element of funds there that can do stuff and practical in a day. This is about practical stuff we can do right now. And that was why I challenged Scottish Government to put the money back into the treatment industry that had been taken out, because we dismantled a lot of rehabs and day programmes and a lot of these projects that helped people get well, to put the money straight back in. And that's not happened yet.
Yeah. Despite the promises, You know, Angela Constance, the Minister for Drug Policy, made a promise last year, and we will hold her feet to the fire on this, where she claimed we would get 1,000 rehab beds a year for the next 5 years. So that means 5,000 new rehab beds for Scotland. She said that there was a 20 million pot for that for the next 5 years. And I tweeted this morning, how's that going, Angela? Because I know for a fact we've only got 5 new beds in Glasgow since that money was announced over a year ago. So they claimed that they wanted to bring it up to the European average, which is 11 episodes. Now, what that would mean in Scotland would be at least 5,000 new beds. So let's see. They were claiming in their latest report that there was just under 500 beds. James and I know that that's
a lie.
Well, 100 of those beds aren't available. The Dutch in Castlecraig for a start, and they're now including heroin-assisted treatment beds and stabilisation centre beds and mental health beds in those numbers. So we're in the process of putting together an FOI request to actually break down the numbers of who and where those beds are, and we will continue to hold their feet to the fire because, you know, they're lying.
Thanks for that. Can I go to Neil now, please, and then Alison?
Yeah, I just wanted to thank both of you for such a rich contribution. Certainly, you've given me a huge amount to think about. I guess rather than me telling you what I think, because I think what you've proven is that we've all got a lot of listening to do to the experts, and you've demonstrated, both of you, how deep your knowledge is and your experience is and valuable that is to policy development. But in terms of, I hear what you're saying about decriminalisation, and I certainly don't see it as a panacea or as some kind of quick fix, because it's not. But I'd be interested to know, in terms of ACEs and experience that people have, you know, going into care is a very traumatic experience in and of itself. Transferring between different placements, we know that the more placements that children in care have, the greater the trauma that they hold on to as they progress through that. Do you think that, I mean, I think if decriminalisation is important for a couple of reasons. One, it's an additional traumatic event if you end up in the criminal justice system, and the message that gives to you as an individual. And the second thing is that the amount of money, and James alluded to this, the amount of money that's been spent on non-therapeutic custodial care, if you like, could be reinvested. So it would need to be ring-fenced, invested in public health and the therapy types of initiatives that you've spoken about today. Certainly, you know, I've got a great service in my constituency, FAST, the Fife Alcohol Support Service, but it deals with all substance misuse. And they are very much, you know, staffed by people in recovery, but they haven't got the resources. And last point I'll make is we're about to head into an absolute humanitarian crisis, and that is only going to, you know, act as a supply line for people into substance misuse. But I'd be really interested in your thoughts about that shift from investment in criminal justice into recovery programs.
Great point, Neil. What do you both think?
Yeah, absolutely. I was just Googling there. In England, I know that they've promised, just in the last few weeks, they've promised a drug recovery wing in every prison. So these are to be set up in every single prison across England. They had something called the WRAPT programme for many years, and that will now be reinstated. And that was, you know, basically people like me and James, they live in recovery and abstinence-based wings. I can see the attraction around decriminalisation for that very reason. But I think in Scotland, we already have de facto decriminalisation that was introduced last year. I think there's difficulties it's not straightforward. But if we had recovery wings in prisons, we could start work. You know, it's almost like a captured environment, isn't it? If you've got the right people there to deliver the right programme, and there are many great programmes. We've got the Addicted Prisoners Trust here as well, and that's set up in England. And on the 1st of September, we are having a conference in Woodlands Church in Glasgow, and we'll be presenting lived experience recovery, multi-million-pound lived experience recovery organisations in England are coming up to show any Scottish government civil servants or people in power who show up at the conference. They're all invited, whether they come or not is another question. But these are multi-million-pound organisations who are led by, managed by, founded by, developed by people like me and James. Whereas at the moment in Scotland, they've just gave Natalie up at Cisco 50 grand a year. So that gives her 3 part-time staff. Do you know what I mean? That's not what we need.
Impossible.
We need to really invest in lived experience recovery organisations. We really need to put our weight behind people like James, like Natalie. And one of the great things about that conference, and also the event on the 31st, which we're having in George Square, the 31st of August at 7 p.m. It's a candlelit vigil. You know, we're not only are we keeping the feet to the fire, we're keeping the Scottish public informed on what's actually happening here. We're raising the debate, and we're actually, you know, like by events like this, we're talking about a much bigger problem that all of us suffer from to one degree or another. You know, all of our communities are affected by this in Scotland, unless you're, you know, really, really wealthy. You will be affected by this, and even then you might be as well. So I think the oncoming tsunami of the cost of living crisis, you know, a fellow activist was saying the other day, I think the drug deaths might stop, they might go down. And I was like, are you insane? We've got a cost of living crisis just about to hit. This is this is a tsunami that's coming of alcohol and other drug deaths. Can you imagine sitting in your home and watching your electric meter go up to a tenner before noon? There's another easy way to heat your home, and that's a bottle of vodka, or even worse, a bag of Street Valium at 20 pence a pop. That'll take the coldness away. Do you know what I mean? So there's absolutely no doubt in my mind we are about to hit a tsunami of addiction deaths. But it would not surprise me, and I do not trust this government one iota, that they would not. And looking back at other campaigns, just in the history of campaigns, like, you know, thinking about the Mesh, the women who campaigned around Mesh, thinking about Liverpool and, you know, Hillsborough, governments lie. Governments lie about statistics.
Routinely.
If they do that, if they start to do that, if they aren't already. I mean, Natalie and I, we could tell you, and I'm sure James could as well, you know, at least 3 deaths, you know, at the weekend of people in Glasgow that we either know or know friends of. So we're taught, you know, they're saying 3 a day in Scotland. We know there's 3 a day happening in Glasgow. So those lines are already there as part of the statistics, you know. So, but it wouldn't surprise me if that continues. But yeah, the cost of living crisis is just going to make everything 100 times worse.
Incredibly sad and unnecessary.
Could I add to what Neil was saying? So I've got a saying, Neil, that I say a lot actually, and it goes like this: it shouldn't be easier to get into prison than it is to get into rehab. And I don't think that recovering from addiction is best placed to happen in a prison setting. I think if there's a will with governments to create therapeutic wings in prisons to recover from addiction, then they should be happening by way of a community disposal, which would expose them to the wider psychosocial support they need in the community. Because we also know that the people who are likely to be arrested or put in prison because of addiction, it's low-level crime. So they don't really need to be in prison in the first place, because they aren't really a danger to society. They lock the people up we're angry at, not the people we're frightened of. And I think that the justice system should be transferring that funding into health, and it's best placed in the community. So I would totally agree with you in that respect. But recovery should happen in a prison setting as well, because some people do have to need to go to prison. Prison needs to exist. I'm not a total abolitionist, although a lot of people think I know that prison needs to exist. I also know that the times I was in prison, if I'd have got my addiction treated earlier, it would have prevented a whole host of trouble for a lot of people, including myself. But I take full responsibility for my behaviour. Like, people go to prison all the time for how they behave on alcohol, but nobody's shouting about the correlation with, we can't lock him up because he's got alcoholism. You go to prison for how you behave at the end of the day. And whether you've got an addiction or not shouldn't be an excuse. But in the context of rehabilitation and making Scotland a safer society, you should be exposed to the best type of rehabilitation for that.
That goes back to Portugal. So that's what they did. They did abstinence, rehabilitation, and social integration. Do you know what I mean? It's really simple. That's why Portugal worked. They massively invested in that and the prevention programme. But if you look on a Facebook meme, you'll see it's because they made drugs, they decriminalised drugs. The data doesn't bear that out. The data says it was because of their treatment system and because of their prevention programmes.
Yeah, no, massively helpful, guys. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Alison, what was it that you wanted to say?
Well, the one thing that I did want to say was that this is perhaps the most positive conversation I've had in the last 12 years or something. So it's really unusual to speak to people who are clued up and interested and are not willing to bullshit people, because I've been a mental health professional. You're right. We are the biggest bullshitters in the world, because if we don't bullshit, then it's us that gets into it. It is us who get the flack. So it's easy to identify an addict. It's easy to criminalise an addict. It's easy to go, look at him, junkie. I live in Coatbridge, okay? And this town is known as Junkie Central. Now, if anyone ever said that to my face, I would knock them out cold. However, this is your problem, is the middle classes who have decided to run Scotland like it's their fiefdom and not an actual nation full of people who've got needs, wants, desires, want to put shoes on your feet, want to not take drugs, want to go on holiday rather than get loaded. Now, see, this is the thing, is that most mental health professionals I've ever met, and I include myself, most of us have done drugs. I used to look down, I worked in psychiatric intensive care, right? And I used to look down the list of drugs used, okay? And as I would work my way down the list, I would tick them off and go, done it, done it, done it, done it. And I'm the nurse. And that's the thing. See, until we actually all acknowledge that, in fact, none of us has the answer, okay? We might all be able to comfort each other and actually treat each other with dignity and respect. And that's the thing. Putting evil people in prison is important. Putting somebody who's so desperate to get out of their own hell that they're willing to get out their face in front of their wains is a real major social issue. And you see, Scotland needs, I know this is kind of bullshitty, but what it needs is, see all the flowery bullshit, it needs to finish, right? And all the quangos and I'm an expert in this, that, and the other. I was once at a review meeting for a guy who was a heroin addict, right? And it said that he had now I looked at the form and it said he'd successfully completed the methadone program. And I was like, that's amazing. I've never met anybody who's done that before. And then in very small letters, it said is maintained on a dose of 125 mils. Right. And I was like, so when the meeting came round and they said to the Scottish woman, as they always did in London, do you have anything to say? And then they all tightened their sphincter. I said, I don't know where you're fae, but where I'm fae, completed the methadone program means they don't do it. Not that you're junkying them up twice a day. And the consultant psychiatrist said, as ever, Alison, you are candid, you are honest, and you are interesting. Let's move on. Okay? And that's where we are, is all these medical experts, all experts in every field, be it politics. If you want health, then put people who know about health in charge of health. If you want people to not be on methadone, meet people like yourselves who do know what they're talking about. And as I say, all I want to say is this is the most excellent hour I have spent since I came home in 2013. So I want to thank you for that. And I want to say you're inspirational. And if I can help in any way, and can I say, Neil Hanvey, I used to give you a really hard time because I hate the SNP with a passion, okay? But you've spoken with more sense than I have heard from MPs and First Ministers and various other people who are full of the bullshit and full of the token. This is how we're dealing with alcohol. This is how we deal with drugs. No, Scotland will never deal with alcohol because it's our baby. Alcohol is our favourite thing. Everything, you're 14, you're 19, you're 22. Have a drink, have a drink, have a drink, have a drink. You're not having a drink. Why are you not having a drink? And that's the reality, is that real people like yourselves and also people that have lived it, they do live it every day. They're the people who should be in charge. Not, I went to uni for 3 years and now I think I'm the dog's bollocks. And I can tell you who has to live lives of desperation, how to live. That's all I've got to say. Thank you very much for your time. I really appreciate it. I'm very moved.
Alison, that was memorable, and thank you. And
Absolutely brilliant.
Use of the vernacular, because that's exactly what Scotland needs.
Well, you see, I'm just straightforward down the line. Okay, I'm never going to bullshit people. I didn't do it in 20 years of working in the NHS in London. It was my favourite thing in the world to watch every English person in the room sphincter tighten whenever I opened my mouth, because I don't bullshit people. And that's what we need.
Yeah.
And everybody in this, I appreciate your time. Thank you for inviting me.
Can I just reiterate that warning to Neil about the SNP's direction of travel here? That there is a multi-million, almost billion-pound industry that is supporting and that is, heading towards decriminalising legalisation worldwide. And that is a very populist and powerful movement funded by a guy called, and really interesting guy called George Soros.
Does he sell ganja?
The Open Society Foundation. So, please, and I can understand it is a popular and populist policy, and I understand why the SNP might be adopting it, but you have to look deeper into the data here about decriminalisation. It's a wee bit like Rorschach's ink blot. If you're really interested in this area, I can school you on it in depth. And I'd love for you to get in touch, and I'd love the opportunity to school anybody on it, because it is incredibly populist, but that doesn't mean to say it's good. Yeah. And it's populist because there's that money behind it, that funding. You've got Facebook memes on this stuff. And just going back to Alison's point about ganja, decriminalisation, legalisation, etc. The biggest, Britain, Theresa May's husband is the biggest.
Oh, don't tell me this! Don't tell me this!
He's the biggest cannabis grower in the UK. The UK are actually the biggest cannabis growers in the world. So there's decriminalisation and legalisation is on everyone's agenda here. Certainly, everybody who wants to make money.
You've raised a very important point there. Can I just come back on that, Anne-Marie? Because when you're talking about that, is this paving the way for legalised addiction, where big corporations start introducing sanitized versions of, all of the new opioids the OxyContin and all of those types of drugs, which we know people who go into hospital for a spell for a quick bit of surgery and they come out on OxyContin and then they find it really difficult to get off these new therapies. Do you see that as a way of paving people into a sort of legal addiction?
There was a survey done in 2018 and it showed, and I can dig it out for if you want, it showed that 1 in 6 people in the UK were concerned about their codeine use. Now, codeine is drugs like cocodamol, oxycodone, there's various different strengths and derivatives. But if 1 in 6 people are concerned about their codeine use in the UK, that tells us we're on the brink here. We're on the brink. There's a lot of people already stoned. There may even be some in this room if those statistics.
I wish.
Yeah.
I really wish.
You've certainly given me, a heads up on a blind spot that I hadn't seen. and I'm happy to speak to you afterwards. But I have to say, I have no influence over SNP policy.
Not anymore, you don't? Thank God.
No.
Well done, you.
I mean, all I would say is I've lost count of the amount of times I would have left the party since I did leave it, because well, it's one thing after another, and I just go, no, that would have been a trigger.
Aye, every day is just a new hell. Thank you, SNP, for that.
Yeah.
Well, listen, folks, we've come to the end of the session. I cannot thank you enough. Anne-Marie, James, Neil, Alison, this has been a real learning experience for me, that we're able to continue the communication, keep in touch with each other. I want to speak to your colleague that you mentioned, Anne-Marie. I need to speak to him soon. I think there's a lot of work that we have to do, and I would like to finish by saying some words that I didn't write, but I've read them often, and I know that others in here will have too, and it's simply this. I hope that Scotland and all of us here can have the courage to change the things that we can change, and do so as quickly as we possibly can.
Yeah.
Thank you all.
Amen.
Thank you. Your bags of courage from us.
Yeah, amen.